Of a question, that would be appreciated.
All right, so I'm PG, I'm interning at the Cato Institute. Congratulations for your panel. I love your message on how we should focus on the positive for private enterprise rather than denigrating government, however evil it may be. However, for some reason there's still the stigma that free enterprise is what brought us to the Depression. What would be some of the arguments we could use to counter that, considering how much evidence there is that capitalism is actually what causes poverty?
I can just, one brief comment. I think one is just articulating that you are positive for something and moving in some positive direction. I don't know that that view is prevalent among some, but I think that if we are shown to be pursuing opportunity and pursuing better policies that help people in a tangible way, I think that's the most effective way to combat it. And I mean, you know, you can make broader arguments about, you know, economic growth and benefits and all these things, but I think that putting it in more human terms like that might be one part of it.
I'm going to jump in on that. I think there's also just a really quick and dirty answer is that free enterprise has done more to lift more people out of poverty and oppression than any other government system ever created in the history of mankind. That should be like a basic talking point of every conservative and libertarian and every conservative libertarian politician, period. Like, I don't know why that's not our go-to answer on some of this stuff. And the overwhelming majority of statistics and data collection has revealed this. Bill and Melinda Gates had a great little 4-minute video thing on how we've nearly eradicated abject poverty over the last 70 years, or not really eradicated, but the rates have gone down to like a quarter of of people on planet Earth living on less than $1 a day, or the equivalent thereof, to something like less than 10%, which is really, really remarkable change. And we should just talk about how free enterprise empowers people and lifts them out of poverty and not be ashamed of it. And in fact, I'm a little vindictive, and if you ever played a board game with me, you'll know this. I think we should go on the offensive. It's not just enough to respond to say free enterprise is providing a positive solution, but I think we really do need to go more on the moral offensive and say, in fact, progressive liberal politics has done more to put people into poverty and trap people in cycles of generational poverty than any other political ideology. The entire experiment of communism, as Matt Lauer described it, as a pivotal experiment in the Russian history during the Olympic opening games. Whatever. But we should be more willing to call them out on their BS, basically, and how oppressive that those policies have been for countless millions of people around the globe, but especially in our own experiment in the United States.
Yeah, if I could have one thing on that, I know the moderator's not really supposed to answer the questions, but I think one thing that is important to not lose sight of, particularly on the right, when we have a crisis where people really are suffering in real terms right then, and something needs to be done. I mean, I'm very libertarian, but I'm also pragmatic, right? Like, if you walk into a room and your child is on the floor bleeding because they've cut themselves with a kitchen knife, the answer is to stop the bleeding. The answer is not to get rid of the kitchen knives in the house, right? So you have to think through what is necessary at that point in time. And so being in the good years, an advocate, an ardent advocate for free enterprise that extols the benefits from poverty alleviation, but also says, there are people who are really suffering, and just, a blanket, completely hands-off system isn't necessarily going to provide them with what they need to get ahead because of just how the system is structured right now, and having the types of solutions that, that AEI, that Cato are putting out there to help those people where they are and advocating for them in good and bad times. And in bad times, being willing to be more creative, not being like, our jobs, program is the Keystone Pipeline, which is an important part of jobs creation, right? But you need more than that, right? So being able to respond differently in different times, I think, is an important way to say, a free market economy is there for everyone at any point in their lives.
Ammon Simon, how do you solve the donorism problem? In the sense that there are a lot of ideas out there, and you guys laid out a lot of them, and would that all politicians got behind them, but they aren't, because there isn't really a market for it, because they don't get donations from rich people when they talk about poverty. they don't get voters because oftentimes the middle class make up a lot of the voters instead of the poor. How do you address that problem? Why, you know, maybe there's an Arthur Brooks pact or something.
Well, in my issue, it's very simple. We spend so much money on prisons, and people see that they're getting, you know, more and more taken out of their paycheck, and they're like, "We're paying for what? Why are we putting these people in cages for this amount of time? How much is it costing again? Are you kidding?" And then, you know, you let them out, and they, you know, they just reoffend, and you throw them back in. How is this, you know, people like, "You're not spending my tax money efficiently." But in a broader sense, you also have, you know, you start to see people like Right on Crime that have said, have been able to develop donor bases and saying, hey, these are ways that we can, you know, our laws have gotten a little out of hand. I mean, I didn't talk about it, but there's like a problem with overcriminalization that is actually locking up and taking money away from the middle class and the rich. And people are starting to say, hey, maybe we need to start thinking this criminal justice system in general, and you do see donations on that end, as far as how do we get people to donate to this, to the people who let's be right, has demonized for years. That's a very interesting question.
If you know of anyone, we at Art Street would be interested in talking to them as well. So if anyone else has anything.
I mean, I think the donorism problem is really interesting, and Eamon kind of, I think, is treating with this question because we were talking about this over lunch today too. But I mean, it's a very serious question that a lot of organizations and institutions in DC are not willing to discuss, and that's in large part because a certain set of brothers tends to fund a significant portion of several organizations. And I think that really does stifle, and it's not just the Koch brothers and the Koch Foundation, but there really is a limited number of large donors that limits the intellectual creativity of the conservative movement. I think that's changing, and I think that's a good thing that that's changing, but we need to constantly be challenging our assumptions on things and not just be satisfied with fighting the battles that we should have been fighting 10, 15 years ago, but to be willing to take risks and experiment with folks who are trying innovative policies. I think R Street, and this isn't just a plug for Lori's organization, but I think R Street is a good example of this. I will be first in line to question sometimes whether or not R Street is a little squishy on things. But I would much rather experiment with R Street and their very innovative policy approaches to very significant issues and see where that goes than to kind of fall into the traditional donor traps of not funding candidates or institutions that are willing to think outside the box.
Ray.
Oh, okay. Ray Lehman of R Street.
Save your question for me.
Is being positively for something, whether it's you know, changing the benefit cliff or work vouchers or whatever, I mean, being open to the fact that your solution may actually cost more, because historically the answer has been no, and that's ended the conversation right there, that unless you can show savings, it can't be a conservative solution.
I think so. I think yes. I think if you look at the problem and you look at kind of the human value and you look at where policy is not serving people, I don't think that there is anything wrong with advocating for a policy like the EITC, that you cannot get it if you do not embrace a core American value, which is work. It's not a handout, it's a hand up. And I don't think there's anything wrong with government having a role in helping people get out of really difficult situations if they're willing to engage in a reciprocal relationship.
Brandon, I'm Erin Greenwood. Brandon, I was interested in your story about June, and you seem to suggest that, you know, June's story sounded very sad and very hard to deal with, and you suggested that it was sort of the left's fault for not being able to help her. I'd like to know specifically what it is you think the right should do to help June.
Sure. So I think that June's not her real name, obviously, but I think that the solution comes down to a little bit what I said about like our fundamental understanding of human nature and the role of government, and that if we expect the role of government to be nothing more than an aggregation of power and data and like intellectual experts, like whoever these people coming out of whatever government school is popular that year, to solve all these problems that we have been and we will continue to be sorely disappointed. And that the answer instead is to empower local individuals and local communities. I think what's happened, for example, with the faith-based initiative offices out of the White House over the last 5 years in this administration has been shameful, in how we've completely undermined a large section of private sector actors who sought to help. And I don't think that extends to just religious-based organizations, but to a lot of community and local organizations. So I think that, so my answer then is generally, or is essentially this, that the federal government, if it seeks, or we've decided that Congress has decided to spend federal funds on these instances, that there should be a preference to issuing grants, to providing financial incentives and tax benefits to local community organizations that best know the actors in the field, essentially. So, I mean, this isn't to brag about CLADC, but our understanding of like local Anacostia lifestyle and culture is much more effective than what some bureaucrat, not even that far down Pennsylvania Avenue, understands. I was talking to a kid, one of the site we work at, who's mentored by some of the folks that we work with. They operate like a little miniature Brother Big Sisters program, and he was talking about how, or his teacher was talking about how they were asking in like a geography quiz or something, like, which river is the greatest divide, which river like greatly divides the United States? Obviously we would all probably answer the Mississippi, and his answer was the Anacostia River. And I tend to think that he might have actually had the correct answer in that. And so I think that there's got to be an empowerment of like local organizations and then civil society, and I think that doesn't have to be federal funded, but I think that does have to be, when we're using federal funds, to have a preference for local based organizations as opposed to like a federal agency or, you know, my proverbial nameless faces bureaucrat within the board. Which I think I might have stolen from Jonah Goldberg, so if anybody talks to him in this meeting, I'm not claiming full credit for that phrase.
Hi, I'm Darlene. I'm glad that you brought up the local communities and families again, because I noticed that a conflict that often isn't addressed is that on the principal level, things like what Elise and Brandon were saying, the importance of family and community tends to be stressed very heavily, but economically and in the work vouchers program that Brad mentioned, you're actually asking individuals to cut those ties and to move towards somewhere where there might be more economic opportunity that they don't have the community to support them. Is there a way to square that? And can you guys hash out which of those is, if there isn't a way to square that, like, have a cage match, who wins?
Yeah.
It's a difficult question. I mean, there clearly are economic benefits to be had there. But there are community ties that are severed as well.
So if I could jump in here, I think one thing that's really important to note is as we've experienced community breakdown, we've also experienced declining geographic mobility. And it seems actually that people being able to self-select into an area where they can be productive, have a good job, raise their family, and feel fulfilled is a better way to build community ties. So since we started measuring geographic mobility in the 40s, it's declined. I think it's down to a third of what it was. I think it was at close to 4%, and now it's at a little over 1.5% of households who move in any given year. And actually, if you look at single unemployed men, they used to move at close to 8% a year, and now they're down to, sorry, I just wrote an essay about this. This is where I'm getting details. But now they're down to like 2.6% per year. And so I think that that is actually one of the things that is holding communities back, is a declining geographic mobility, rather than, so I mean, I understand, right? I took like my husband who had never lived anywhere else and my child who was like the only grandchild on either side and moved him 700 miles away from where we had all of our family ties. So just on a personal, anecdotal level, I get that it is difficult to lose that type of community. And it's certainly difficult for people who haven't had a lot of opportunity to think about taking that risk and moving elsewhere. But it actually, to have that sort of fluidity in the labor market seems to keep community development in place rather than the opposite. So that's just what I would note as an interesting feature.
And I'll add a speculative thing too, or more anecdotal, because I think that people, regardless of, you know, we think of community as like a set area, you know, like a geographic region where people know their neighbors. But there's also a certain community in people that are like-minded and share things, right? And so if you look at, like, illegal immigrants are generally incredibly mobile and responsive to the labor market. And they seem to largely move into communities that are similar to, that share their kind of cultural values and a lot of things that they can also identify with. And so I think there is something to be said for other forms of community that might not be explicitly geographically based.
Well, there are two different types of policy questions too, right? So that some of these questions on like the macro level, Jonathan had some good and some, very misguided like ideas on criminal justice reform. And I used to be a prosecutor, so this may be why I'm saying this. But I think that these are like macro level questions that have macro level policy implications and require federal action. Some of the other things we've talked about allow local community empowerment, or how you rhetorically make the case to your neighbor on why they should vote for specific candidates or specific policy initiatives, is very much a different question. That there's really truly been like a loss of the desire to be persuasive to our neighbors, I think, is really sad, and that we need to gain that back. But I think that they're often you ask how they can get squared. I think they are easily squared. So I actually had this same question to Michael Strain last night at a dinner, who was talking about, gosh, what was he talking about? I forget now. Oh, I think he was talking about extending unemployment or long-term unemployment benefits or something, and then creating like block funds to give to the long-term unemployed to avoid having to pay them over 99 weeks long-term unemployment insurance. And I said, well, this is a great idea, but like, what about like the local level, I had the same question, and his response was, well, I'm just a national like macro guy, so this is what I'm thinking about. And I think that's a really good answer, actually. I was kind of like, okay, well, that makes sense. So that's our macro answer. What's our local answer? And I don't think you have to necessarily square all these things away like they're competing with one another, but that it's really I guess a menu, a series of policy preferences that have to be implemented on the local, state, and federal level. I think, unfortunately, we are so far gone on losing political battles on the local, state, and federal level for these ideas that we need to fight on the local, state, and federal level, and maybe even on the individual level for a lot of folks. But
I think one thing that is important is to keep things in a self-selection model, right? So like you can, if you make block grants available, there's actually a Mulvaney bill that does that right now. Whether it will go anywhere, we will see. But it's not as if you're not going to get unemployment benefits if you don't indicate a willingness to move. You can stay in your community if you need to take care of your elderly parents, or you can go elsewhere if that's what works for you. And I think that helps in sort of the national perspective. This answer has gone on for a really long time. So, if any of our panelists have something to add, yeah.
One little thing, if we can get the government to stop breaking up families, I would very much appreciate that sort of micro level analysis. I mean, I come from this from a very personal standpoint. My father was a cop. My brother was a drug felon. He missed the first 7 years of his daughter's life because he was in prison because he made some stupid mistakes. And I'm not saying the government, I mean, granted, yes, I'm libertarian, drugs should be legal. But insofar as, hey, how about let's not throw someone in a cage for violating these laws? You want to fine them, you want to put them in community service. There's all sorts of options where society can still pass this judgment like we don't want people to do this. But when he got out, he couldn't get a job. He couldn't do anything, and he basically wasted away until he died last year. And it's this idea that let's not it's like macro level, micro level. The macro level basically killed my brother, and it's that sort of understanding. If we want to humanize this, let's humanize it like that, and understand that this is the government doing this. And yes, anti-drug laws, most people who enforce them are well-intentioned. But it really is the government destroying families, and painting it any other way just sort of ignores a giant problem.
And with that, I think we have a little bit of time to hang out here, but we all eventually, and before too terribly long, can make our way to Laughing Man, or I think the options are really endless in this neighborhood, but that's where I'll be. So, there you go.
So again, let's thank